Have you ever wondered what it would be like to have ice cream with Jesus? That's the premise of our podcast. Two goals. Our first is, again, to convince people to find quiet, intimate times with Jesus. Maybe with a bowl of ice cream or whatever your favorite treat is. And just enjoying his company, talking over whatever it is you need to talk over. He loves you. And as we've learned, he lives inside of us. Walking with Jesus inside of us is not supposed to be that far different than if he was here physically. But one of the points he also told us was, make disciples. We're his disciples. If you've repented of your sin and turned from darkness to light, from the power of Satan to God, if you have renounced all and taken up your cross and following him, then you're his disciple. And what I've learned as I studied through the red letters is every time people gathered around Jesus, he taught. Whether it was in the temple, by the seaside, whether it was on the streets or on a mountaintop, Jesus taught. So if you spend any time with Jesus, chewing on his red letters, chewing on his word, the Spirit of Christ within you will speak and will teach you. That's what we're going to talk about today. Is one of Jesus's powerful teachings is recorded in Matthew. Now you have to understand that how Matthew wrote his gospel was for disciples. He loved taking Jesus's teachings and putting them into longer sermons. He wasn't worried about timeline. If one subject fit with this subject or this parable fit with this, Matthew loved putting them together. Was the Sermon on the Mount word for word everything Jesus said on that day? Could have been. Or because Matthew loved compiling Jesus' sermons, he put them in one. We know from the various way the writers wrote that Jesus preached the same thing everywhere he went. His gospel was his gospel. His teachings were for his disciples everywhere he went. So the Sermon on the Mount was taught on the plain. Luke records it, the Sermon on the Plain. And it sounds very much like the Sermon on the Mount, with a few changes here and there. That tells us that Jesus, everywhere he preached, he modified his teaching to whom he was teaching and who he was speaking to. It's a wonderful thought that everywhere Jesus went, he taught these things that we're about to learn on the Sermon on the Mount. And the disciples heard them over and over and over again. So that when it was time for Matthew to sit down and write it, it was probably pretty easy. But it starts with when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on the mountain. So he sees the crowds and he steps up and he gets on a high hill where it's in a bowl-like so that as he speaks, his voice carries and as many people can hear it for a long way. He sits down and his disciples came to him. Again, a disciple sits at the feet of his teacher, follows him around, and learns everything they can for what? For the purpose of becoming like them. You have to come to Jesus and his red letters with not only the purpose of studying them and understanding them, but with a heart that says, I will do them. And that's his disciples. So when Jesus opened his mouth and began to teach them, what he's going to teach them now is, what's it going to cost you to be my disciple? His disciples have only been with him for a short period of time. They just started following him, and the first thing Jesus did when they started following them was heal. He healed the sick. He opened blind eyes. He opened deaf ears. He drove demons out. This really made them draw close to him. But now he sits them down and he says, this is what it's going to cost you to be like me. This is what it's going to cost you to be my disciple. In the Sermon on the Mount, he tells them what he wants our hearts to be like and what he wants us to seek. Then he tells us how we should interpret Scripture. Then he tells us how we should act and how we should do. Then he warns. He warns against those who choose not to follow him. And we're going to look at all of that over the coming weeks. But the first thing he says is, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Let's break this down and see what Jesus was really telling them. The word blessed has many different meanings. But for the way Jesus used it, it could be translated spiritually prosperous, inwardly peaceful, and filled with joy. So if you broke that down and used all those words, Jesus could say, spiritually prosperous, inwardly peaceful, and filled with joy is the person who is poor in spirit. The word can also mean spiritually mature, to be admired or worthy of respect. So he could set all that, spiritually prosperous, inwardly peaceful, filled with joy, very spiritually mature, to be admired and worthy of respect is the person who is poor of spirit. Well, now, if that's what Jesus is saying, and that's what he's telling us we need to do, we'd better understand what it means to be poor of spirit. To be poor of spirit is the idea of being humble. But it's also knowing that you bring nothing to the table. It's a deep humility. It's an understanding of the difference between us and the one we're speaking to, God. One commentator one time said it's the picture of someone who absolutely has no real use of their hands and their feet. Their body doesn't react. It's someone so handicapped they can do nothing but look to others for everything. That's what poor in spirit means. They know their lostness. They know that without mercy, they can never make it. They can never do it. But it's also the idea of position. It's the idea of knowing what my position is in the kingdom. So Jesus tells us to be spiritually blessed is to know first who we are when we come to God and our lostness and our need. But also, once we've come to God and we've become children of God and we are disciples, how we should act. It comes with two sides. So let's investigate the rest of Jesus' words. Remember, Jesus interprets Jesus as he interprets the rest of Scripture. And we as disciples are now on the mountain with him. We're sitting at his feet, or we're sitting at a table having a bowl of ice cream. And we're listening to Jesus teach us what he says makes you spiritually prosperous, filled with joy, and to be spiritually admired and worthy of respect as his disciples. Two men went up into the temple to pray. One a Pharisee who was steeped in religious law and understood the Bible very well, and the other a tax collector who in his day was one of the most hated people. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus: God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Can you see the two different kinds? One haughty in spirit, one poor in spirit. One's very religious. I do all these religious things. But he has no real picture of who he really is. Poor, in need of mercy, in need of grace. It reminds me of the church of Laodicea. You think you're rich, but you're terribly poor. Well, Jesus goes on to tell us, this man, the tax collector, went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. God can't help but to lift up and exalt those who come to him in humility, seeking his grace, seeking his help, seeking empowering strength. God just loves to help us. In another place, Jesus called a child to himself and set him among his disciples and said, "Truly I say to you, unless you change and become like children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven." This is reminding us that we needed at one time to realize we were on the wrong road, we were doing the wrong thing, we were being haughty and proud, we were being rebellious against God, and we turned and accepted his grace, and now we're following him. But he says, unless you have a childlike heart, you won't do it. So whoever will humble himself like this child, he is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Now this was important. Jesus tells his disciples, the one who is the greatest among you must become like the youngest, and the leader like the servant. If anyone wants to be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all. These are all important statements, because Jesus is trying to lead us to be poor of spirit, not only when we come to Christ, but after we've become his disciples. How should we act? How should we treat one another? If we want to be spiritually mature, filled with joy, and walking as his disciples, then we have to have this spirit. Now we need to understand that in the world that Jesus lived in, the youngest among the servants was the one who had the dirty jobs. It was the job no one else wanted. And that was the job of washing feet. When Jesus went into the upper room to have dinner with his apostles, he purposefully made sure that the rich person didn't have one of the children there to wash feet. He wanted to teach them something. Scripture says that they all get up in the upper room and nobody has had their feet washed, and nobody has offered to wash any feet. Instead, it says that they all began to argue who was the greatest. Luke tells us they started talking about who is the greatest among them. Now, why would they do that? Well, because they believed Jesus came as a Messiah who would be a conquering king. Jesus has already told them that when he comes in his great glory, all of them will sit on 12 thrones. And so they're all sitting around thinking about the thrones one day they'll sit on. And they begin arguing over who should get the best throne and who's the greatest among them. And Jesus, knowing all this, sets up a situation where now they're all sitting at the table and no one's washed anyone's feet. And Jesus gets up, gets the water basin that's already there and a towel, and begins to wash their feet. And he washed every one of their feet, including his betrayers, Judas's feet. And it says in John 13 that when he had washed their feet and taken his garments and reclined at the table again, he said to them, "Do you know what I have done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are correct, for so I am. So if I, the Lord and the teacher, washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I gave you an example, so that you also would do just as I did for you. Truly, truly, I say to you, a slave is not greater than his master, nor is one who sent greater than the one who sent him. Remember, these are disciples. They're going to be apostles. They'll be sent ones. If you know these things, you are blessed, spiritually mature, to be envied, filled with joy, filled with inner peace, if you do them. This is all very important to Jesus' teaching on what it means to be blessed are the poor in spirit. We're poor in spirit when we come to Him looking for grace. We're poor in spirit when we come to Him looking for mercy. And we should come broken, knowing we can't do this on our own. But from that time on, after He has robed us in a robe of righteousness and put shoes of peace on our feet and gives us a ring of authority, now we need to live like Jesus, humbly, poor of spirit, willing to do whatever it takes to win someone else, to love someone else. This is also the idea of love, because at the beginning of this, the writer John tells us that Jesus loved His disciples unto the uttermost. He loved them as deeply as He could by serving them and washing their feet. If you think about that story, it should have been the other way around. They should have all been clamoring to wash His feet. They should have been arguing with each other, elbowing each other out of the way to wash their master's feet. But instead, they all sat at the table waiting for one of their brothers to wash their feet. They sat at the table arguing over who should wash feet, who's the greatest and who's the least, who should be the one washing our feet. And Jesus took that opportunity to show them that the greatest among you is the servant of all. The one who makes themselves like the youngest child. The youngest child's job in the household of servants was to wash the feet. Jesus said, you be that way, and you'll be my disciples. And I will use you, and I will glorify my name in you, and you'll become just like me. And isn't that the purpose of being a disciple? Saints, I hope you take some time this week to get your own bowl of ice cream, find a quiet place, and sit and talk with Jesus. Maybe you could talk to Him about this. Maybe there's something else heavy on your heart you just need to talk to Him about. And I promise you, if you'll do this, just like the men on the road to Emmaus, your heart too will burn.